Thank you for joining me in another edition of Mastering the Math of Business with Lauren Young. Today we're going to be talking about the break-even sales point calculation. It's a really easy calculation to do, and it's an interesting calculation from my perspective because you've got this camp of consultants who place a lot of value in this, and they're always quick to ask, what's your break-even point? And typically they ask that because they're trying to get you to admit that you don't know it. And do you need to know it? Yeah, it's one of those calculations that's good to know because it can have some impact on your decision making. In other words, you're less likely to spend money on fixed costs if you have a sense of what sales you're going to have to generate to cover that additional overhead expense. So there is a place for break even. That's why we're going to introduce the calculation today. A couple of things to appreciate about the break even sales calculation. One is it really is important for a business that has a really high fixed asset base. In other words, if you've got a lot of fixed assets and a number of those assets are on credit, in other words, you're making debt payments against those assets, knowing what your break even sales point is important because it's going to help you appreciate how much you have to, in other words, what's your nut? How much do you have to sell to cover those already entered into obligations? Another thing to appreciate about a break-even sales point is that the lower the break-even point, the healthier the business. In other words, you don't have as much sales pressure on you because you don't have as big of a nut to have to cover. Put another way, the smaller the percentage of your sales required to cover your overhead and debt, the less susceptible you are to burning through any cash reserves you may have. So let's take a look at a business. We're going to look at it on two levels. One is, what did they do last year? And what are they going to do this year? And the reason why I do like to look at this is I think this is a really key point. Anytime you're trading $1 for 4 quarters, you're a break-even business. In other words, if you collect $1 in sales and you spend 4 quarters to generate those sales, you're break-even. And that is not a sustainable business. So with that, let's look at this math example. Here you got a business that had $2.4 million in fixed costs. That meant that until they hit $8.6 million in sales, in other words, they needed $8.6 million in sales to cover the $2.4 million. That's when they started earning profits. The reality is they were earning profits through the course of the year. It didn't just start to happen at $8.6 million. But the point of break even is important in that there had to be a minimum amount of sales to cover those overhead costs. This particular client wasn't going to add much to their overhead in the plan year, and so their sales only had to go to $8.6 million to cover their overhead nut. And a big part of that is because they paid down a lot of their overhead costs. What I mean by pay down is they basically stopped some of them and made them more variable with sales. That's an important principle. The other thought to keep in mind with regards to break even is it really does work well if you can shape demand with your pricing. So in other words, look at the airline industry. The airline industry will vary their pricing by flight, depending on the number of people joining, already buying tickets on that plane. So that's why the earlier you buy your tickets, the lower the cost. As you get closer to the flight date, the prices go up. And those prices jump based on how much seat capacity is remaining in that plane. In fact, they can start to bring those prices down a little bit if they think it's going to shape the demand curve, similar to hotels. In other words, if you can change your price in the moment to drive higher demand, then break-even sales points are a really important number to know. But for most businesses, being able to be that flexible with price in such a way that you can change demand, the demand curve for what you do, isn't reality. And so let's just appreciate the math here. Again, it's real simple. It's your fixed costs. In this case, it's your SG&A, your selling, general, and administrative expenses, with any compensation being paid to the owners, interest expense, as well as taxes. You then also need to know what your cost of goods sold is, as well as what your net sales are going to be. This is how you then do the math. There's no conditions here in this first calculation. It's just a simple mathematical equation that gave us the result of they need an extra $600,000, an extra $30,000 in sales to cover their change in overhead, and that's because the direct costs have gone down as a percentage of sales. So that's why you're picking up $228,000 here in fixed costs, but you're only going up $30,000 in sales because this percent against sales is lower. So that takes pressure off the business. Anytime you can manage expenses down is a win. Now let's look at a scenario here. So here's the scenario. Fixed costs go up 5%. And so what does that mean? Well, if you pick up an extra $132,000 in fixed costs beyond what you planned them to be, that means you got to generate at least $460,000 in sales to cover that $132,000 increase in fixed costs. That's why you want to appreciate what your nut is, because your nut represents how much you have to sell to break even. If you're a business owner and you're not satisfied with the money you're making, in other words, your answer to this question is no, then the odds are pretty high that you're in that trading $1 for 4 quarters scenario. In fact, you probably have some months where you're trading $1 for something less than 4 quarters. In other words, you're subsidizing your sales because you're not covering your costs adequately. Don't continue to suffer this way. There's a better way. And the offer that we're making here to you at B-CPR is that if you go to business-cpr.com/F4, that's going to trigger you into our free business assessment. What we'll do here is we'll take a look at your business results. We'll assess where cash is being wasted. We'll help you appreciate what's not working as well in your business as it should. And we're going to play back to you some tips on what you can do to stop wasting your cash inflows. Because really, when you stop and think about it, this is the goal. The goal is you want to make something more than $1 on every dollar of sales you generate. In this little visual, you got a business generating an 11-cent return on every dollar of sales they collect. So bringing in $1.11 against $1, that's the goal. It's always the goal. Breaking even is not the goal. And so appreciate your break-even sales point. Use it as a tool to assess how at risk are you to eating into cash reserves because your expenses are rising faster than your ability to increase sales. Break-even helps you appreciate that dynamic. More importantly, though, it's about knowing what's happening in your business so that you can be in this position and not this position. Again, thank you for tuning in to another edition of Mastering the Math of Business with Lauren Young. If you like this video, likes are always appreciated. If you have questions, give them to us. We would love to interact with you. And then lastly, take advantage of the offer. This is really intended to help you experience more satisfaction from the hard work you do every day. That's why we do these video series, and that's why we're here. Thanks so much for tuning in. Goodbye.